always get shocked for the first time, but sometimes you get shocked back to your senses multiple times. And there's just a lot to wrestle with in these things. So a few things to bear in mind when you're preaching and teaching from this material. If the parable is a simple comparison, make sure you allow the context to determine the comparison. Let me give you an example. Kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. I can't come up with every characteristic of a mustard seed that I think relates to kingdom truth and preach a 17-point sermon on how mustard seeds are like the kingdom. I mean, it's like Jesus says, talks about childlikeness in the kingdom. I hear a lot of sermons that say a lot of things that are legitimately true about how childlikeness relates to kingdom living. The problem is not all of them are intended by the gospel writer in context. It's not a free-flowing analogy where I can find any connection I want and draw on it. The gospel writers intend something by the comparison. And my responsibility is to find the point of comparison. So if it's a comparison, simple comparison in the parable, see what's going on contextually, because that'll help you determine the point of the comparison. If it's a story, the complexity of the parable is determined by the number of character categories. The most complex parables will have 3 categories of characters: a God figure, a good category, and a bad category. So, in the parable of the talents, there are more than 3 characters. There are 4 characters, but there are only 3 categories. The master represents God. The first 2 servants fall into the good category, though not equal. The third servant falls into the third category, that of the unfaithful servant. Prodigal son parable, same thing. So the most complex ones have 3 categories of character. There may be less. The crucial issue then is to help the audience identify with character in the story, which may be determined by their standing in relationship to God. Let me illustrate this from the parable of the prodigal son, which is determined by their standing in relationship to God, not maybe. Prodigal son parable. A lot of times we preach that as if we are the lost boy rather than the older brother. And so even if I came to Jesus 73 years ago, I'm supposed to identify with the lost son. Celebrate that I'm no longer lost. In many ways, I'm supposed to identify with the older brother in the story, not the younger. Which is a big part of what's going on in the context of Luke 15, where Jesus, in the first 2 verses, Luke sets the stage for us. Jesus is defending the company he keeps leaves at mealtime. And those who are challenging him are the older brothers in the text. So I have to ask myself, am I just supposed to congratulate myself for being the lost son? Or do I function in ways that cause me to identify more with the older brother and therefore fall under? So, I mean, do you see how that twists and turns? I mean, I think of myself as the younger brother. I think of myself as the younger brother. And all of a sudden, boom, I'm confronted with the fact that I'm the older brother. And yet, if there are people in the room who aren't yet Christians, what character in the story do they identify with? The younger brother. So a lot of times if I preach that, I'm trying to help each group identify with the character, help them figure out where they fit into the story. Just tell the story in a way that helps them just naturally begin to identify with where they belong in the story. But it may actually, the sermon doesn't always apply equally to everyone. A parable may apply differently to two different groups that are hearing the same sermon. Those who are lost, it applies to them in a lost son kind of way. Those who are found, it applies to them in an older brother kind of way. Same story. Does that make sense? Austin, you hear what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yes.
There's a lot of discussion in parables on whether parables have one meaning or multiple meanings. That's a big issue in parable studies. I think parables have one meaning, but with multiple significances, relevances, applications. The parable of the prodigal son is not a 3-point sermon. It's a 1-point sermon. It's about the heart of God for the lost. But that applies differently depending on which character you identify with in the story. Now, there are a number of things that are true about God, according to the prodigal son parable. But really, for us, we are identifying with the brothers in the story. Even though experientially it might be possible to have a child wander astray and experientially identify with the father in the story, that may be a way that I'm drawn into closer fellowship with Jesus and that God works through the story in my own formation. But really, in the story, I'm supposed to identify with my two brothers and help them see that if you are lost, God is not just willing to accept you. That God is the one who not only runs to meet you, but sets his own dignity aside in doing so. Everybody's always so concerned to protect God's reputation. And in the cross, God is allowing his own dignity to be compromised for the sake of reconciling us to himself. That's not an uncommon thing in the Bible. Then you realize in the Old Testament, when Israel loses a battle, God's reputation is damaged. Because all ancient peoples viewed warfare as spiritual. It was not just a battle between armies, it's a battle between deities. And so every time God allows his people to be disciplined through a loss of battle, he's allowing his own reputation to be compromised. The cross isn't the first time God sets aside his dignity, so to speak. I understand God's dignity is never actually compromised. There's a sermon in that. Sometimes you maintain your dignity by appearing to set it aside. There's something of God in that. I said, weeping, as I delivered the sermon at one of my closest friends' funerals. He died while I was here, preaching in chapel in November. He died the morning after I preached in chapel. And I found out, and I walked laps over there in that circle in front of the building for about an hour. Because I thought, man, I'm in trouble. I don't have any time to process this. And I knew I was going to be preaching his funeral because I'd agreed several years ago that I would come back from anywhere I was in the world to preach his funeral. My friend was in his late 70s, and he had Parkinson's. And I walked with him through that journey. And my friend Bill and his wife were very hospitable people. And so they were legendary. They asked at his funeral how many of us in the room had been in their home for a meal. There were about 400 of us there. And he looked around the room, and everybody's hand was up. One of the most remarkable things about Bill, he was one of the he brought people together at a level that was just remarkable. If Bill said to me, I've got a friend I want you to meet. With most people you know, you can start pinning down the categories, can't you? You could not do that with Bill Abernathy. It might be somebody that looks like me. It might be an African American. It might be a Latino. It might be an Asian. It might be somebody that lives in the U.S. It might be somebody that lives in another part of the world. It might be somebody who had a PhD like him. It might be a homeless guy off the street. It might be a 5-year-old kid. It might be an 85-year-old woman. It might be a Methodist. He taught at Asbury for several years. It might be a Christian church person. It might be a Democrat. He was a registered Democrat. It might be a Republican. It might not even be a human. It might be an animal. He was amazing in his ability to bring people together. And I sat at his funeral that one of the remarkable things to me about his life was how even with Parkinson's, I talked about how Bill just shed a whole new light on biblical hospitality for me, because he and Sandra welcomed people into his home. And once he could no longer fill his own plate, he would still invite people into his home and let other people fill his plate. And I would hear people talk about how Parkinson's robs a person of their dignity. And in that sermon, I said, Parkinson's did not rob Bill Abernathy of his dignity. Parkinson's proclaimed his dignity. but his reputation's intact. God is secure. And God is not threatened by what looks to people to be a loss of dignity. So for our good, in a position of strength, God does things that seem to set aside his dignity, but actually demonstrate what dignity really is. And so that father pulls up his robe and runs to his lost son. No self-respecting Jewish dad would ever do that. What are you doing? You've got a reputation to uphold. Have a little self-respect. Calvary demonstrates a God who, like the father in the prodigal son parable, picks up his robe and runs to us.